Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of the giant fish accounts. Imagine, if you will, the city of Osaka in the late 19th century. It is a city of water, woven together by a network of canals that shimmer under the soft, gray light of a low-hanging sun. The air carries the scent of damp earth and the sharp, clean aroma of cedar wood from the merchant boats that glide silently along the Yodo River. This is the heart of Japanese commerce, a place where fortunes are not made with a shout, but with the steady, rhythmic click of a wooden abacus and the soft rustle of silk. In the year 1883, a small seed was planted in this fertile ground. A textile wholesaler named Itaman & Company opened its doors, beginning a journey that would span over a century. The floors were made of polished dark wood, and the walls were lined with bolts of cotton and linen, stacked high like the silent archives of a long-forgotten library. The early days of Itaman were defined by a quiet, steady persistence. In the Semba district, the traditional merchant quarter, the atmosphere was one of profound discipline. Picture the young clerks in their dark kimonos, moving with measured steps across the tatami mats. They would unroll long scrolls of ledger paper, their brushes dipped in ink that smelled of pine soot and bone glue. Every transaction was recorded with a focus that bordered on the spiritual. The textiles themselves were a tactile symphony, the rough grain of raw hemp, the cool smoothness of fine indigo-dyed cotton, and the intricate, hidden patterns of ceremonial silks. For decades, this was the soul of the company. It was a trading house built on the tangibility of thread and weave, a foundation as solid as the stone bridges that arched over the city's quiet waterways. But as the 20th century progressed, the world outside the wooden shutters began to accelerate, and the quiet rhythms of the Semba district began to change. Following the devastation of the mid-20th century, Japan emerged into a period of frantic, neon-lit reconstruction. Itaman & Company, once a modest textile house, found itself navigating a landscape of steel and glass. It was during this era of transformation that a young man named Yoshihiko Kawamura entered the scene. He was a figure who seemed to mirror the aspirations of the age, composed, ambitious, and possessing a gaze that always seemed to be looking just beyond the horizon. Imagine him sitting in a high-backed chair, in an office that still held the faint, lingering scent of the old textile days, even as the sound of jackhammers echoed from the rising skyscrapers outside. Kawamura was not content with the slow, steady growth of the past. He watched the massive financial giants, the big fish of the Japanese economy, and he felt the pull of a deeper, more turbulent current. He was a man who understood that in the new Japan, power was no longer just about the goods you could touch, but about the invisible flow of credit and the abstract dance of capital. By the time the year 1975 arrived, Yoshihiko Kawamura had ascended to the presidency of Itaman. His rise was marked by a shift in the company's internal atmosphere. The old, dusty silence of the textile warehouse was replaced by the low, constant hum of air conditioning and the sharp, rhythmic tapping of typewriters. Kawamura moved through the corridors with a silent intensity, a leader who commanded both respect and a certain, unspoken apprehension. He began to pivot the company's focus, turning away from the familiar textures of the garment trade toward the more lucrative, yet far more ethereal, world of real estate and speculative investment. Under his guidance, Itaman started to grow at a pace that seemed almost unnatural. The company was no longer just a merchant house. It was becoming a predator in the vast, murky waters of the Japanese bubble economy. Kawamura forged deep ties with the powerful Sumitomo Bank, securing lines of credit that seemed bottomless, allowing Itaman to swallow up land and assets with the hunger of a giant fish rising from the depths. As the 1980s dawned, the transformation of Itaman was complete. The humble beginnings of 1883 felt like a distant, fading dream. The company's headquarters were now a cathedral of modern finance, where the light reflected off polished marble floors and the air was filtered and cool. Kawamura had become a titan, a man whose name was whispered in the boardrooms of Tokyo and the backrooms of Osaka alike. But beneath the surface of this glittering success, the foundation was beginning to tremble. The giant fish accounts were being born, massive, complex webs of debt and speculation that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The very ambition that had propelled Kawamura to the heights of power was now drawing him into a vortex of scandal that would eventually shake the entire nation. Tonight, we have seen the birth of this ambition. We have walked the quiet canals of old Osaka and felt the first tremors of a change that would lead to one of the greatest financial mysteries in history. For now, let the image of those early silks and the steady click of the abacus linger in your mind. The water is deep, and the current is pulling us further in. The air inside the Osaka headquarters of Itamen began to change as the 1970s yielded to the 1980s. For nearly a century, the company had been defined by the tactile, earthy scent of raw wool and the dry, rhythmic clicking of textile looms. It was a world of fabric bolts and honest trade, where a man's word was as solid as the heavy cotton he sold. But as the new decade dawned, that familiar smell of dust and fiber was slowly replaced by something sharper, something more sterile. It was the scent of expensive cologne, of freshly printed banknotes, and the ozone of high-rise ventilation systems. The humble legacy of 1883 was being folded away like an old suit, tucked into the cedar chests of history to make room for a vision that was far more shimmering and perhaps far more dangerous. At the center of this transformation stood Yoshihiko Kawamura. He had arrived at Itamen in 1975, not as a weaver or a merchant, but as a rescuer sent from the towering glass fortress of Sumitomo Bank. Imagine him walking through those wood-paneled halls for the first time, a man of precision, a creature of the financial elite. His footsteps did not carry the weight of a trader, but the calculated gravity of a banker. He had been dispatched by Akiro Isoda, a powerful figure at Sumitomo, with a singular mission, to breathe life into a staggering textile house. But Kawamura did not just want to save Itamen. He wanted to recreate it in his own image, turning a second-tier trading company into a global titan that would make the world tremble with its reach. Kawamura spoke often of a concept that would become the heartbeat of his tenure, the strategy of the giant fish. In the quiet, dimly lit boardrooms of the 1980s, he would describe this philosophy with a calm, hypnotic intensity. He believed that the time for catching small fry, the steady, low-margin profits of the fabric trade, was over. To survive in the roaring current of the Japanese economic miracle, one had to go after the leviathans. He wanted the big catch, the massive deals that would settle the ledger in a single, monumental stroke. He looked out from his office windows at the sprawling city of Osaka, seeing not a grid of streets, but a vast, deep ocean where the largest prizes were waiting to be hooked. This ambition was not just a business plan. It was a hunger that began to consume the very foundations of the company. The shift was subtle at first, like the slow turning of a great ship in the night. The ledger books, once filled with the names of garment makers and local tailors, began to feature entries for luxury real estate and international investments. Kawamura's eyes moved away from the spinning wheels of the factories and toward the horizon. He saw golf courses in Vancouver, shimmering industrial parks in Thailand, and sun-drenched housing projects in San Diego. The company was no longer just dealing in what people wore. It was dealing in where they lived, how they played, and the very ground they walked upon. The transition felt intoxicating. There was a thrill in the expansion, a sense of limitless possibility that mirrored the rising fever of the nation's economy. But beneath the glitter of the new ventures, the old stability of the textile trade was being hollowed out, replaced by a mountain of debt that grew larger with every passing moon. To fuel this hunt for the giant fish, Kawamura leaned heavily on his connections at Sumitomo Bank. The relationship was like a deep, dark well of capital that never seemed to run dry. Billions of yen flowed into Aitaman's accounts, provided by a bank that trusted Kawamura as one of their own. This influx of wealth changed the very atmosphere of the office. The hushed, respectful silence of the old guard was drowned out by the bravado of a new generation of directors. Men like Sumitsu Ito, who spoke the language of aggressive land deals and high-stakes speculation. They moved with a frantic energy, their days a blur of champagne toasts and midnight negotiations. The simple beauty of a well-made cloth was forgotten, discarded in favor of the abstract thrill of a soaring stock price or the acquisition of a rare piece of European art. As we sit here in the quiet of tonight, it is easy to see the shadows lengthening. We can almost feel the chill in the air as the company drifted further and further from its shores. Kawamura believed he was a master fisherman, guiding his vessel toward a glorious sunrise. He saw himself as a visionary who had liberated Aitaman from the dusty confines of its past. But the giant fish he sought were heavy, and the lines he used to catch them were beginning to fray under the immense tension. He was building a kingdom of paper and dreams, supported by the immense, invisible scaffolding of bank loans. The salesman's ambition had become a lighthouse, but its beam was flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the waters of the coming decade. The transformation was complete, but the price of such a metamorphosis was yet to be paid. For now, the city slept, unaware of the cracks beginning to form in the foundation of one of its most storied institutions. Previously, we observed the slow erosion of the firm as it drifted further into the dark. Tonight, we watch the moment the darkness finds its true shape. The air in the city feels different tonight, doesn't it? It is thick with a humidity that clings to the skin, and the rain falls in a steady, rhythmic pattern against the glass of the high-rise offices. It is a sound that should be comforting, yet it carries a certain weight, a reminder of things hidden beneath the surface. In the world of high finance, shadows are not merely the absence of light, they are tools, and every shadow needs an architect. This is where he enters our story, stepping out of the rain and into the history of the giant fish accounts. His name was Ho Yang-young. He did not arrive with fanfare or a trail of expensive lawyers. He arrived in a simple black coat, smelling of damp wool and the faint, bitter scent of loose-leaf tobacco. He was a man who lived in the spaces between the lines of a contract, a fixer who could make the impossible disappear and the illegal look like a simple clerical error. Imagine him sitting in that mahogany-paneled office, the only light coming from a single desk lamp that casts long, spindly fingers across the carpet. Ho Yang-young was not a large man, but he occupied space with a terrifying stillness. He had a way of watching people that made them feel as though their secrets were being read like a morning newspaper. To the outside world, he was a consultant, a man of international business with a vague portfolio. But in the underworld of Seoul, his name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and genuine fear. He was the bridge. He connected the polished, air-conditioned boardrooms of the powerful with the gritty, neon-lit back alleys where debts were settled in blood and silence. He knew which officials could be bought with a quiet dinner and which ones required a more permanent form of persuasion. As he sat across from the firm's directors, he did not look at the ledgers. He looked at the men. He saw their greed, yes, but more importantly, he saw their cowardice. He knew then that he would not just be their fixer, he would be their master. The secret dealings did not begin with a grand conspiracy. They began with a single, handwritten note pushed across a table. Ho Yang-young understood that to hide a mountain, one must first turn it into dust. He began the process of deconstructing the firm's assets, scattering them like seeds across 1,000 different fields. He spoke of the giant fish accounts not as a vault, but as an ocean. Deep, cold, and vast enough to swallow anything. He told the directors that they were no longer just businessmen, they were fishermen. But in his mind, they were the bait. He spent those first few weeks meticulously mapping out the connections. He worked through the night, the only sound being the scratch of his fountain pen and the occasional click of a lighter. He designed a system of shell companies that moved through 3 separate continents, winding through the tax havens of the Pacific and the old, silent banks of Europe. Every transaction was a ghost, a flicker of numbers that vanished the moment it was observed. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a man like Ho Yang-yung. It is the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He brought with him a crew of individuals who existed on the fringes of society. Men who knew how to handle the physical realities of the underworld, while the accountants handled the digital ones. They were the muscle that ensured the silence was maintained. Ho Yang-yung would often say that a secret is only a secret if the person who knows it is afraid to speak. He cultivated that fear like a gardener. He didn't use threats, he used logic. He would sit a man down and calmly explain exactly how his life would fall apart if a single digit was misplaced. He would describe the smell of a prison cell or the coldness of the Han River in winter with such poetic detail that the listener would find themselves nodding in agreement before he was even finished speaking. He was the architect of a new reality, one where the law was a suggestion and profit was the only deity. As the weeks turned into months, the giant fish accounts grew. They became a living thing, a leviathan resting beneath the surface of the firm's legitimate business. Ho Yang-yung watched over it with a fatherly pride. He had created a masterpiece of corruption, a web so intricate that even he sometimes seemed mesmerized by its complexity. But beneath the brilliance of his design, there was a rot. You can feel it, can't you? The way the air in this story is beginning to sour. The firm was no longer an entity of commerce. It was a shell, a hollowed-out vessel carrying a cargo of lies. And at the center of it all stood the fixer, his hands clean of the grime but his soul stained by the ink of every fraudulent contract. He had brought the underworld into the light of the corporate world, and in doing so, he had ensured that no one would ever be safe again. The shadow had not just entered, it had taken root. It was waiting for the first sign of weakness, the first crack in the foundation, to pull everything down into the deep. We leave Ho Yang-yung tonight in his office, the rain still falling, the city lights shimmering in the reflection of his window. He is holding a glass of amber liquid, watching the bubbles rise and vanish. He is a man who knows that every rise is followed by a fall, and every secret is eventually whispered to the wind. But for now, he is in control. The architecture is complete. The secret dealings have begun, and the giant fish is hungry. As we close our eyes and let the rhythm of the rain take over, remember that the most dangerous shadows are the ones that look exactly like the truth. Rest now. Let the details of the fixer and his web drift away. You are safe in the stillness of the night. Sleep deeply and let the world fade into the quiet. The story will wait for tomorrow. Good night. The rain outside the office window continues its steady, rhythmic pulse, a sound that has become the heartbeat of this long night. In the reflection of the glass, Ho Yang-yung looks at a man who has built a world out of thin air. We left him there, holding a glass, surrounded by the silence of his success. But as we move deeper into the story, we must leave the mahogany-lined walls of the executive suite and step into the cold, pressurized air of the private vaults. It was here, in these silent, climate-controlled rooms, that the transformation began. This was where the physical world was reshaped to fit the needs of a growing, invisible hunger. The giant fish accounts were not merely columns on a ledger. They were a vast, underwater ecosystem of debt, and to keep them submerged, Ho Yang-yung needed an anchor. He found that anchor in the quiet, prestigious world of fine art. Imagine a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, unassuming and gray, its heavy steel doors hiding a treasury of stolen time. Inside, Rows upon rows of wooden crates were stacked like ancient tombs. When the lids were pried open, the scent of linseed oil and old mineral pigments would drift upward, mixing with the sterile smell of the air conditioning. There were canvases by modern masters, their surfaces thick with impasto and abstract emotion. There were moon jars from the Joseon dynasty, their milky white glazes glowing softly under the flashlight's beam. To a collector, these were objects of profound beauty, but to Ho Yang-young they were something else entirely. They were tools. They were the raw materials for a grand alchemical experiment, where a painting worth 50,000 won could be transformed into a collateral asset worth 5 billion won. The process of this deception was as delicate as the ceramics themselves. It began with the acquisition. Ho Yang-young would purchase large quantities of artwork, sometimes hundreds of pieces at a time, often from obscure galleries or private sellers who didn't ask too many questions. He favored the works of reputable Korean artists, names that carried weight in the halls of the elite. Once the art was in his possession, the stage was set for the appraisal. In the dim light of the storage units, experts would arrive. These were men and women with impressive titles and deep knowledge, but their eyes were fixed on the influence of the giant fish. They would look at a canvas, note the signature, and then, with a stroke of a pen, they would sign their names to documents that inflated the value of the work by 1,000%. A single, quiet room could hold the supposed value of an entire shipping fleet. With these inflated certificates in hand, the giant fish moved toward the banks. Think of the confidence required to walk into a boardroom at Kyungnam Bank, carrying nothing but a folder of papers and a photograph of a porcelain vase. Ho Yang-young presented these artworks as solid, immutable collateral. He spoke of the rising art market, of the cultural heritage these pieces represented, and of the security they provided for his massive loans. The bankers, perhaps blinded by the prestige of the art, or perhaps too deeply entangled in the web of the giant fish to pull away, accepted the valuations. In one instance, a collection of ceramics that had been purchased for a mere few hundred million won was pledged as security for a loan of over 100 billion won. The difference between the two numbers was a void, a hollow space filled only by the breath of a lie. This was the true art of the deception. It wasn't just about the fake appraisals, it was about the psychological weight of the objects. When a bank holds 1,000 paintings in a vault, they feel rich. They feel safe. They do not see the dust settling on the frames or the way the canvas stretches over time. They see only the numbers on the screen, numbers that allow them to keep the credit flowing. For Ho Yang-young, this was a desperate race against time. The interest on his existing debts was a rising tide, and the art fraud was his way of building the levy higher and higher. He moved capital through these accounts like water through a sieve, using new loans to pay off the old ones, always searching for the next masterpiece that could justify another billion won. The ceramics sat in their crates, silent witnesses to a financial disaster that was growing larger with every passing day. As the months turned into years, the collection grew to over 600 pieces. It was a phantom museum, a gallery of shadows that existed only on the balance sheets of the banks. Ho Yang-young would occasionally visit the storage units alone. He would stand amongst the crates, the hum of the cooling fans the only sound in the dark. He knew that if the lights were ever fully turned on, if a truly independent eye ever looked at the glaze of those jars or the texture of those paintings, the entire empire would dissolve. But for now, the deception held. The giant fish continued to swim in deep, dark waters, pulling the weight of 240 billion won behind him. The art was his shield, a beautiful, fragile mask that hid the rotting core of a debt that could never be repaid. As we sit here in the quiet, we can almost feel the fragility of it, like a glass vase perched on the very edge of a high, narrow shelf. In the deep, cooling hours of the evening, when the sounds of the bustling world outside begin to soften into a distant hum, We find ourselves back in the quiet sanctuary of the investigation. The air in the archive room is cool, smelling faintly of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of cold ink. We have moved past the physical warehouses and the rows of empty crates. Now we are following a trail made of light and shadow, traced across the glowing screens of computers and the brittle pages of international bank statements. It was here, amidst the endless rows of figures, that a name began to surface from the depths of the ledgers. It was a name that seemed almost whimsical, a strange choice for a corporate entity of such magnitude. They called it Giant Fish. Imagine the scene in the auditor's office during the late weeks of 2003. The fluorescent lights overhead hum with a persistent, low-frequency buzz that vibrates in the back of the skull. The investigators were poring over the records of a subsidiary known as Bonlat, a name that sounded soft and harmless. This entity was based far away, in the humid, sun-drenched offices of the Cayman Islands, where the turquoise waters of the Caribbean meet the white sands. But the money it supposedly held was anything but local. In the books, Bonlat was a titan. It held a security, an investment of such staggering proportions that it was meant to be the bedrock of the entire company's stability. This was the Giant Fish, a fictitious asset valued at nearly 4 billion euros. It sat there on the balance sheet like a slumbering leviathan, providing a sense of security to investors and lenders alike, a weight that balanced the scales of a crumbling empire. To the naked eye, the Giant Fish was documented with meticulous care. There were letters on heavy bond paper, bearing the prestigious letterhead of the Bank of America. If you were to run your fingers over the pages, the texture would feel right. The ink was dark and authoritative. One specific document claimed that the account held 3.95 billion euros in cash and liquid securities. It was the ultimate shield. Whenever an auditor asked where the money was, the company pointed to the Giant Fish. Whenever a bank questioned the company's ability to pay its mounting debts, the Giant Fish was invoked as proof of hidden wealth. But the reality was far more fragile. The document was not a genuine confirmation from a bank. It was a masterpiece of deception, created not in a high-security printing facility, but in the quiet of a back office using a scanner, a computer, and a simple pair of scissors to align the forged signatures. The smell of the warm toner on the paper was the only true thing about it. The mechanics of this deception were as rhythmic as the tides. Money would move in complex, circular paths, flowing out of the main company into shell entities with names like Zilpa and Kerkastel, and then eventually, on paper at least, into the mouth of the Giant Fish. It was a system of perpetual motion that required no actual fuel. A single euro could be counted 10 times over as it moved through this digital labyrinth, creating the illusion of a massive, growing profit. The auditors, tired and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of transactions, often looked at the destination rather than the journey. They saw the total at the bottom of the page and believed. They did not see the vacuum beneath the numbers. They did not hear the silence of the empty accounts. They were blinded by the scale of the lie, for who would dare to invent 4 billion euros out of thin air? The very audacity of the amount acted as its own protection, a lie so large it became a landscape. As the investigation deepened, the philosophical weight of the Giant Fish began to press down on the team. They realized they were not just chasing a thief, they were chasing a ghost. Every time they reached for a solid asset, their hands passed through mist. The Giant Fish was the centerpiece of a phantom museum, a digital monument to greed. It represented the moment where the line between reality and fiction was completely erased. The transactions were recorded in the 1990s and into the early 2003, a decade of steady, quiet accumulation of nothingness. The auditors at firms like Grant Thornton and Deloitte had held these papers, checked the math, and signed their names, their pens scratching against the paper in a rhythmic, reassuring sound. They were part of the ritual, the keepers of a temple dedicated to a god that did not exist. The giant fish was the ultimate deception, a creature of pure ink and imagination that held the fate of thousands in its non-existent fins. But a fish that does not exist cannot swim forever. Eventually, the water begins to recede. In the final months before the collapse, the pressure to keep the giant fish submerged became unbearable. The interest payments on the real debt were growing, and no amount of ink could satisfy the creditors who wanted actual, tangible currency. The investigators found notes scribbled in the margins of internal memos, frantic calculations trying to reconcile the €4 billion phantom with the reality of an empty vault. The air in the executive offices grew heavy with the scent of anxiety and expensive espresso. They knew that once the giant fish broke the surface, the waves it created would wash everything away. It was no longer a question of if, but when. The ledger was a ticking clock, and every fictitious transaction was a second lost. As the sun began to rise over the investigation, the truth was finally ready to emerge from the depths, cold and shimmering and devastatingly clear. The air in the headquarters of the giant fish had grown thin, weighted with the scent of ozone from the overworked servers and the stale, recycled chill of an air conditioning system that never seemed to rest. We walked down these corridors now, feeling the thick, industrial carpet beneath our feet, a deep navy blue that swallowed the sound of every footstep. It was in these quiet passages where the first cracks began to show, not in the loud proclamations of a boardroom, but in the small, hesitant glances exchanged between colleagues over the tops of their computer monitors. The machinery of the firm was still humming, a rhythmic, low-frequency vibration that you could feel in your teeth if you stood still long enough, but the harmony was slipping. The giant fish was a creature of immense proportions now, its digital scales shimmering with the light of 1,000 inflated accounts. But inside the belly of the beast, the digestion was beginning to fail. For those who had been with the company since the early days, those who remembered when the office was just 2 rooms and a single shared desk in the late 1990s, the change was more than just financial. It was a shifting of the light. They noticed how the paper trails were becoming shorter, more fragmented. A long-time auditor, let us call him Thomas, spent his afternoons tracing the flow of capital through the eastern subsidiaries. He would sit in his cubicle, the yellow glow of his desk lamp casting long, thin shadows across the ledger sheets. He began to find recurring entries that made no sense, small, repetitive transfers of $42,000 that appeared and disappeared like ghosts in the machine. When he asked his superiors about these ripples in the water, he was met not with answers, but with a cold, polished silence that felt like a door being gently, but firmly, closed in his face. It was during the summer of 2004 that the outsiders began to arrive. They did not look like the engineers or the analysts who had built the giant fish. These were men and women in suits that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, with voices that were sharp and precise, cutting through the soft, ambient noise of the office like a blade through silk. They took up residence on the top floor, behind heavy doors of frosted glass. They were the new guardians of the boardroom, brought in to manage the perceived growth, yet they never seemed to look at the actual spreadsheets. They spoke in the language of abstractions, synergy, leverage, and liquidity. To the old guard, these outsiders felt like a different species altogether, predators that had moved into a coral reef they did not understand, yet were determined to rule. Friction began to heat the hallways. You could hear it in the break room, the sound of a metal spoon clinking against a ceramic mug, a sound that felt more like a warning than a morning ritual. The employees who had once shared lunches and stories now sat in a wary solitude. They noticed how the internal reports were being edited by hands they didn't recognize. Data points were smoothed out, the jagged edges of loss rounded into the soft curves of projected profit. It was a masterclass in atmospheric pressure. If you questioned the trajectory, You were told you simply didn't see the scale of the vision. The giant fish was too big to be seen all at once. You had to trust the current. But the current was becoming erratic. In the quiet hours of the evening, when only the security guards remained, the hum of the building seemed to change from a song of progress to a low, mournful groan. In the archives, where the physical records were kept in rows of gray steel cabinets, the air was cooler still, smelling of old ink and dust. One evening, a junior clerk discovered a discrepancy that felt like a cold hand on the back of her neck. A series of accounts, supposedly holding $350 million in liquid assets, were registered to an address that turned out to be a small, abandoned post office box in a coastal town 3,000 miles away. She stood there, the fluorescent light flickering above her, holding a single piece of paper that weighed more than any stone. The whispers were no longer just about management styles or boardroom politics. The whispers were about the void. The giant fish was not just swimming in deep water. It was swimming in an ocean of its own making, and the shore was nowhere to be found. The outsiders in the boardroom continued their meetings late into the night. From the street below, the windows of the top floor looked like glowing eyes watching the city. They were rearranging the furniture on a ship that was already listing to the side. The internal friction had reached a point of silent combustion. Longtime employees began to quietly clear their desks, taking home photographs and personal mementos in the dark, afraid that if they stayed any longer, they would be swallowed by the same shadow that was consuming the accounts. The discrepancies were now visible to anyone who dared to look closely at the light. The illusion of the great, shimmering fish was beginning to blur, its scales falling away to reveal a skeleton built of nothing but debt and desperate hope. The water was receding faster now, and the silence in the corridors was the only thing left that felt real. The air in the boardroom of the Itaman headquarters had grown thick, a heavy mixture of expensive tobacco and the stale scent of tea left to cool for too many hours. It was 1990, and the night was deep, a dark veil draped over the city of Osaka. Outside, the rain was a persistent, rhythmic tapping against the reinforced glass of the skyscraper, a sound like thousands of tiny fingers demanding entry. Inside, the silence was even more oppressive. The men seated around the long, polished mahogany table did not look like revolutionaries or warriors. They wore tailored suits and silk ties, their faces etched with the fatigue of a company that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, drowning. Sumitsu Ito, the managing director, sat at the head, his eyes fixed on the door. He was waiting for a man who did not belong in the world of textile trading, a man whose presence would signal the definitive end of the old guard and the beginning of a shadow reign. When the door finally opened, the man who stepped through was Hyo Young-jung. Known in the whispered corridors of the Japanese underworld as the Dark Fixer, Hyo carried an aura that seemed to absorb the light in the room. He was a bridge between two worlds, the prestigious, century-old halls of corporate Japan and the brutal, disciplined syndicates of the Yakuza. Hyo was not a man of loud threats. He was a man of connections, a shadow architect who understood that in the bubble economy of the late 80s, the most effective weapon was not a blade, but a ledger. As he took his seat, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer a meeting of directors. It was a summit of the economic Yakuza. They were there to discuss the salvation of Itaman, but the price of that salvation was the very soul of the company. He looked at the men before him with a calm, predatory patience, knowing that their desperation had already done most of his work for him. The centerpiece of their first great maneuver was art. It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? To save a multi-billion-yen trading house through the purchase of beauty. But the reality was far more clinical. Hyo proposed that Itaman purchase a collection of 211 paintings and various works of art. As the details were laid out, the sheer scale of the deception became clear. These were not mere acquisitions. They were vessels for moving vast sums of money into the pockets of the underworld. The company was directed to spend 53.5 billion yen on the collection, a figure so inflated it defied logic. Imagine the sensory details of that transaction. The rustle of the thick, cream-colored paper as the contracts were turned. The smell of the ink as Yoshihiko Kawamura, the company president, pressed his seal onto the documents. In those moments, the 211 canvases became ghosts, their actual value irrelevant, their existence merely a pretext for the largest corporate fraud in the nation's post-war history. The paintings were moved into climate-controlled vaults, wrapped in layers of heavy plastic and wooden crates. The smell of the varnish and the old, dusty canvas was trapped inside, hidden away from the world, just as the truth of the transaction was hidden in the company's books. For every painting purchased at 5 times its market value, millions of yen flowed through Hio's front companies and into the hands of the Yamaguchi-gumi. The Yakuza's grip was not a sudden tightening of the throat. It was a slow, rhythmic constriction, like the coils of a great snake. They provided the liquidity that the traditional banks, suddenly wary of the bursting bubble, were beginning to withhold. But this was a predatory grace. With every loan from Satsuma Kanko, Hio's development firm, the debt grew heavier, and the interest was paid in more than just currency. It was paid in influence, in seats on the board, and in the total surrender of Itamen's 110-year legacy. The term giant fish began to circulate among the few whistleblowers who dared to look closely at the accounts. These were the accounts that appeared on the balance sheets, like massive, dark shapes moving beneath the surface of a deep, murky lake. You could see the ripple of their movement. The sudden disappearance of 20 billion yen here, the unexpected loan of 36 billion yen there. But you could never quite see the fish themselves. These accounts were fictitious, shells designed to swallow the company's capital and transport it into the subterranean world of organized crime. In the quiet offices of the junior accountants, the air felt colder. They saw the numbers that didn't add up, the signatures that shouldn't have been there, and the names of companies that existed only on paper. The giant fish were feeding, and their hunger was insatiable. They were pulling the wealth of the textile giant down into the depths, leaving nothing but a hollow shell behind. By the time the sun began to rise over Osaka, the boardroom was empty, but the shadows remained. The Yakuza had not just infiltrated Itamen, they had become it. The transition was complete. The once-proud trading house was now a mechanism for money laundering, its prestigious name a mask for the dark fixer and his associates. As the first light of dawn hit the glass windows, reflecting off the damp streets below, the internal rot was hidden from the public eye. But for those within the circle, the weight of the secret was a physical presence, a heavy, cold stone in the pit of the stomach. The giant fish were no longer just a metaphor. They were the masters of the house, and they were preparing to pull the entire structure down into the dark water. The silence of the morning was not peaceful. It was the silence of a company that had stopped breathing, waiting for the inevitable collapse that was now only a matter of time. The air inside the headquarters of Sumitomo Bank felt heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and the faint, ozone tang of early mainframe computers. In the early months of 1990, the soaring glass towers of Osaka did not just touch the clouds. They seemed to hold them up. Here, in the inner sanctum of what was then one of the largest financial institutions on the planet, the silence was absolute. It was a silence earned through decades of rigid discipline and the quiet accumulation of power. The corridors were lined with polished mahogany that caught the dim light like stagnant pools of water. Every footstep on the plush carpet was muffled, a ghost of a sound that vanished before it could reach the high ceilings. This was the heart of the Japanese miracle, a place where wealth was not just a number, but a living, breathing architecture of influence. Yet, beneath the veneer of stability, a cold draft was beginning to stir, rattling the heavy brass handles of the boardroom doors. As the main financier for the Itaman Corporation, Sumitomo Bank occupied a position of terrifying responsibility. For years, the bank had been the engine driving Itaman's aggressive expansion, pouring billions upon billions of yen into the trading house's coffers. It was a relationship built on the singular vision of Chairman Akihiro Isoda, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear. At 77 years old, Isoda was the architect of Sumitomo's dominance, a titan who believed that the growth of the bank and the prosperity of Japan were one and the same. He had watched as Itaman transformed from a modest textile firm into a sprawling empire of real estate and fine art. But as the 1980s drew to a close, the nature of that growth had changed. The loans were no longer going toward factories or warehouses. They were disappearing into a murky underworld of speculative stock deals and shadowy art galleries, vanishing like stones dropped into a deep, dark well. Inside the bank's ledgers, there existed a series of entries that the staff began to refer to in hushed tones as the giant fish accounts. The name was fitting. These were not the small, manageable debts of honest merchants. These were massive, predatory entities that lived in the deepest parts of the financial ocean, where the light of regulation could never reach. To look at the giant fish accounts was to stare into an abyss. They represented hundreds of billions of yen that had been moved through complex webs of shell companies and offshore holdings, often ending up in the pockets of figures like Ho Yang-yong and other individuals with ties to the Yakuza. The scale was so vast that it defied conventional logic. The bank's middle managers, working late into the night under the hum of fluorescent lights, began to realize that the giant fish were no longer just swimming in their waters. They were consuming the very foundations of the bank itself. Every transaction was a bite, every hidden loan a piece of the bank's soul torn away in the darkness. The first cracks appeared not in the ledgers, but in the atmosphere of the city. In January of 1990, the Tokyo stock market began a slow, agonizing descent. It was as if the gravity of reality had finally remembered its name. At Sumitomo, the pressure became a physical weight. The Ministry of Finance, once content to let the banks manage their own affairs, began to ask questions that grew sharper and more frequent. Investigators moved through the halls with the clinical detachment of surgeons, their pens scratching against paper like the sound of dry leaves. They were looking for the connection between the bank's executive floor and the spiraling debts of Itaman. The comfort of the bubble economy, which had felt like an eternal summer, was being replaced by a biting winter chill. The executives, who once moved with the grace of untouchable gods, now huddled in emergency meetings, their faces illuminated by the harsh light of overhead projectors as they stared at charts that only pointed downward. Imagine the scene in the late hours of an autumn evening. The cleaners have long since passed through the executive wing, leaving the scent of lemon wax in their wake. In the chairman's office, the shadows are long and distorted. Akihiro Isoda sits at his desk, a vast expanse of dark wood that seems to stretch out like a battlefield. Before him lies a stack of reports detailing the true extent of the Itaman disaster. The numbers are written in a small, precise hand, yet they scream of a catastrophe that cannot be contained. There are loans to dummy corporations for paintings that do not exist. There are mortgages on land that is nothing more than a swamp. And weaving through it all is the influence of the Yakuza, who have used Sumitomo's own greed as a backdoor into the heart of the Japanese establishment. The pressure is no longer just financial, it is moral. The chairman knows that the giant fish have grown too large to hide, and the weight of their secrets is about to crush the very institution he spent his life building. By the time the news of the scandal began to leak into the morning papers, the damage was irreversible. The relationship between Sumitomo and Itaman had become a noose. The public, who had trusted the bank with their life savings, began to feel the first tremors of a collapse that would haunt the nation for decades. In October of 1990, the inevitable happened. Ikiro Isoda, the man who was once the face of Japanese banking, announced his resignation. It was a moment of profound significance, a signal to the world that the age of unchecked expansion was over. But as he stepped down, the giant fish remained in the deep. The accounts were still there, the debts still unpaid, and the shadows of the Yakuza still lingered in the boardrooms. The bank had tried to tame the monsters of the market, but in the end, they found that once you feed the giant fish, they never stop being hungry. The water was dark, the pressure was rising, and the true cost of the connection was only just beginning to be understood. The air in Tokyo during the early months of 1991 had lost its electric warmth. For years, the city had felt like it was made of gold and glass, a shimmering testament to a dream that would never end. But as the winter chills settled over the financial district, a different kind of cold began to seep through the walls of the great trading houses. Within the halls of Sumitomo, the silence was no longer respectful. It was heavy. The porcelain skin of the Japanese economic miracle was beginning to show its first, almost invisible lines of fatigue. For those deep within the copper division, the pressure was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, rhythmic tightening of a vice. The exuberance of the late 1980s had been replaced by a quiet, desperate vigilance, as the grand architecture of the market began to groan under its own weight. Deep beneath the public ledgers, in a space where only the most trusted eyes were permitted to look, lived the Daigyo. These were the giant fish accounts, massive, slow-moving entities of credit and debt that lurked in the dark waters of the corporate treasury. They were designed to be invisible, to provide the liquidity needed to corner the world copper market without alerting the regulators in London or New York. But these giant fish were no longer thriving. They were becoming sluggish, weighed down by the sheer volume of the losses they were forced to swallow. Yasuo Hamanaka, the man known as Mr. Copper, sat at his metal desk and watched the glowing green text of his monitor. Each flicker of the screen felt like a heartbeat. The giant fish were beginning to starve, and the secret books that kept them alive were running out of pages to hide the truth. Hamanaka's office was a place of sensory deprivation. Save for the faint smell of ozone from the computer terminals and the dry, recycled air of the ventilation system, he would often run his fingers over the edges of the unauthorized ledger, a physical object that held more power than any official document in the building. The paper was slightly rough, the ink of his own handwriting permanent and unforgiving. He had spent years maintaining the illusion of 5% control over the global supply, but the mathematics were shifting. The interest rates were climbing, and the interest on the secret loans was a monster that never slept. It was here, in the quiet hours of the night, that the first major default rippled through the system. A payment from a subsidiary linked to the Itaman Corporation did not arrive. It was a single missed wire, a small pebble dropped into a deep well, but the sound it made was deafening to those who knew how to listen. The Itaman connection was a shadow that had grown long and dark. Once a proud textile firm, it had transformed into a sprawling vehicle for real estate speculation and questionable investments, often linked to the underworld. As the property bubble in Japan began to deflate, the billions of yen poured into golf courses and luxury high-rises vanished like mist. The giant fish accounts had been used to prop up these failing ventures, creating a web of mutual dependency that was now a web of mutual destruction. When Itaman began to default on its obligations, the stress transferred directly into Hamanaka's copper kingdom. The porcelain was no longer just showing lines, it was beginning to flake. He could feel the eyes of the accountants from the London Metal Exchange, even from thousands of miles away, turning toward his positions with a new, sharper curiosity. Imagine the sound of a fine teacup cracking in a silent room. It is a sharp, brittle noise that signals the end of its integrity. That was the sound of the 1991 financial quarter. The defaults were no longer isolated incidents. They were a sequence. Each one required Hamanaka to move more money, to create more elaborate forgeries, and to lean harder on the brokers who were already growing nervous. The sensory world of the trader became one of frantic, hushed phone calls and the tactile sweat of palms against a plastic handset. He was trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. The credit lines that had once flowed like a river were now mere trickles, and the banks were starting to ask questions that had no safe answers. The porcelain was shattering, piece by jagged piece, and the floor beneath him was becoming a field of glass. By the time the sun rose over the Sumitomo headquarters the next morning, the landscape had changed forever. The news hadn't hit the papers yet, but the internal registers told the story of a $2.6 billion abyss that was only just beginning to open. The giant fish were dying in the shallows, their silver scales dulling as the liquidity evaporated. Hamanaka remained at his post, a ghost in a brown suit, watching the market prices tick downward. He knew that the first defaults were merely the introduction to a much longer, much more painful silence. The structure was compromised, the foundation was soft, and the weight of 10 years of deception was finally, inevitably, pulling everything down into the cold, dark earth of the looming recession. The cracks were everywhere now, and there was no longer enough glue in the world to hold the porcelain together. The morning in London arrived with a heavy, silver mist that seemed to cling to the stone facades of the financial district. It was a quietness that felt heavy, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Inside the offices of the regulators, the day began with the rhythmic, mundane sound of the morning mail being sorted. There was the familiar sliding of envelopes, the soft thud of heavy packages, and the faint scent of damp paper and old ink. For years, the world of copper trading had operated in a state of carefully maintained equilibrium, or so it seemed to the outside observer. But beneath that surface, the currents were shifting. The air in the mailroom was cool, carrying the slight metallic tang of the nearby Thames, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of a wall clock, marking the passage of seconds that would soon become historical milestones. Among the stacks of ordinary correspondence lay an envelope that felt different. It was crisp, white, and bore a weight that suggested its contents were not merely administrative. This was the letter from David Threlkeld, a man who had seen the inner workings of the machine and found them grinding with the grit of deception. As the envelope was sliced open, the paper inside seemed to crackle in the silence of the office. The ink was dark and precise, laying out a narrative that defied the established logic of the markets. It spoke of requests that should never have been made, demands for forged documents, for the creation of non-existent trades that reached the staggering sum of $500 million. The reader's eyes would have traced those words slowly, perhaps pausing to look out at the gray London sky, trying to reconcile the quiet morning with the explosive truths held between their fingers. The letter didn't just speak of numbers, it whispered about the giant fish accounts. In the secretive language of the trade, these were the deep-water shadows, the massive, hidden positions that had been growing in the dark for over a decade. Imagine a vast, subterranean lake where a single entity has grown so large that its movements threaten to crack the very cavern walls. That was the giant fish. The whistleblower's words described how these accounts were used to swallow up the market, cornering the supply of copper until the rest of the world was forced to pay the price set by a single hand. The description was visceral, painting a picture of a predatory force lurking just beneath the floor of the London Metal Exchange, its presence masked by 1,000 smaller ripples that hid the true scale of the beast. As the regulators delved deeper into the letter's claims, the texture of the fraud began to reveal itself like peeling paint from a long-neglected wall. They read of how Yasuo Hamanaka had reached out to other firms, asking them to put their own reputations on the line to help him hide the rising tide of his losses. The letter detailed the specific dates, moments in 1991 and beyond, when the pressure had become so great that the mask had begun to slip. There is a specific kind of rot that sets into an institution when a single individual is given total autonomy over billions. It is a slow, quiet decay, fed by the pride of past successes and the desperate need to maintain an illusion of invincibility. Each paragraph of the letter was a flashlight shone into a dark corner, revealing the cobwebs and the structural cracks that had been ignored for far too long. The whistleblower's letter was an act of profound bravery and also an act of necessity. It broke the unspoken code of the metals market, the idea that what happened in the pits stayed in the pits. The words on the page described a culture of silence that had allowed the giant fish to grow unchecked since 1985. The reader might have noticed the slight tremble in their own hand as they realized the implications. If these accounts were as large as the letter suggested, the eventual collapse wouldn't just be a corporate failure. It would be a seismic event that would shake the foundations of global trade. The letter sat on the desk, a small pile of paper that suddenly felt as heavy as lead, anchoring the room in a new and terrifying reality. The rot was no longer contained. It had been exposed to the air, and the process of dissolution had begun. By the time the final page was turned, the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The ticking clock seemed louder, more insistent. The letter had stripped away the prestige of the Sumitomo name and replaced it with a ledger of lies and the phantom image of the giant fish accounts. It was a moment of clarity that usually only comes after a storm, yet here it was, arriving in the quietude of a London morning. The regulators knew that they could not unsee what had been revealed. The anonymous tips, the rumors that had circulated like ghost stories among traders, had finally coalesced into a formal, undeniable accusation. The whistleblower had pulled the thread, and as the afternoon light began to fade into a bruised purple over the city, the entire tapestry of the copper market started to unravel, one stitch at a time. The era of the Copper King was coming to an end, signaled by the simple, rustling sound of a letter being filed away for evidence. The letter had been the first domino, a thin piece of paper that carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. It lay there on the mahogany desk, its edges slightly curled from the dampness of the evening air. As the investigators stared at the ink, they realized they were not just looking at numbers. They were looking at the skeletal remains of an empire. This was the beginning of what the internal memos would later call the giant fish accounts. In the hushed rooms of the news agency, the air grew thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of high-stakes tension. For months, the journalists had been moving like ghosts through the hallways, their voices lowered to a whisper, their eyes constantly darting toward the shadows. They knew that to catch a leviathan, one must first understand the currents it swims in. The investigation was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing crawl through a labyrinth of offshore shells and hidden ledgers. Every movement was careful, every breath measured, as if the walls themselves were listening. Step by painstaking step, the team began to map the migration of the money. They sat in small, windowless offices where the only light came from the flickering blue glow of computer monitors. Each click of the mouse felt like a heartbeat in the silence of the night. They were tracing a path that stretched from the icy, salt-sprayed docks of the north to the sun-bleached plains of the south. The data was a tangle of interconnected nodes, a web spun by a creature too large to be seen all at once. They called it the giant fish because of the way it seemed to swallow everything in its path, the local industries, the government officials, the very hope of the people. They spent weeks cross-referencing names that appeared on the letter with the vast, digital ocean of the leaked accounts. Every match was a spark in the dark, a small victory that brought them closer to the surface. The journalists worked in a state of suspended animation, forgotten meals growing cold on their desks as they unraveled the threads of a conspiracy that spanned 3 continents. The pressure of the secret was a physical weight, pressing down on their chests during the long, dark hours before dawn. In the city of Reykjavik, the wind howled against the glass panes of the newsroom, a constant, low moan that served as a reminder of the isolation they felt. They were preparing to challenge the most powerful entity the nation had ever known, a company that was woven into the very fabric of their identity. To strike at the giant fish was to risk the wrath of the sea itself. The lead investigator, a man whose hair had turned gray over the course of the winter, spent his nights staring at the wall of documents pinned to his office. He could see the patterns now, the way the bribes were disguised as consulting fees, the way the fishing quotas were manipulated with a flick of a pen. It was a masterpiece of deception, a grand illusion that had kept the public blinded for nearly a decade. The investigation required a level of precision that bordered on the obsessive. Every date, every decimal point, every signature had to be verified. They could not afford a single mistake, for the giant fish had teeth, and it would not hesitate to bite back if it sensed a weakness in their reporting. Then came the storm. It began not with a roar, but with a synchronized series of digital uploads that hummed through the servers. At exactly 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in November of 2019, the world changed. The journalists released their findings simultaneously across 3 major international platforms, their words spreading across the globe like a ripple in a dark pond. The media storm was instantaneous and overwhelming. It was as if a dam had burst, flooding the public consciousness with a tide of evidence that could not be ignored. People woke up to headlines that seemed impossible, stories of systemic theft that had robbed them of their natural heritage. The national panic did not manifest as a riot, at least not at first. It began as a profound, collective silence, a moment of pure shock as the reality of the betrayal set in. Then the phones began to ring, a discordant chorus that echoed through the halls of power. The newsrooms were besieged by calls from citizens, from politicians, and from whistleblowers who had been too afraid to speak until now. The airwaves were saturated with the details of the giant fish accounts, the numbers being read aloud like a funeral dirge for the integrity of a nation. By the afternoon, the streets were no longer silent. Thousands of people gathered in the central square, their breath blooming like white clouds in the freezing air. They held signs that demanded justice, their voices rising in a rhythmic chant that echoed off the ancient stone buildings. The media frenzy was at its peak, with cameras perched on every corner and reporters shouting over the growing din. The investigation had done more than just reveal a crime. It had stripped away the facade of a national hero, leaving only the cold, hard truth behind. The journalists watched from their windows, their faces weary, but their eyes bright with the realization of what they had achieved. As the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the protesting crowds, the weight of the moment was undeniable. The giant fish had been hauled onto the deck, and though it struggled with a ferocity that shook the foundations of the government, the light of day was now firmly upon it. The scandal was no longer a secret kept in a darkened room. It was the heartbeat of the nation, a storm that would not pass until everything had been washed clean by the rain of truth. The square emptied as the evening chill deepened, the thousands of voices that had filled the air only hours before now reduced to a distant, ghostly echo. The transition from the public square to the inner sanctums of power was marked by a shift in the very atmosphere of Tokyo. The choir of dissent had faded into the mechanical hum of the city, but the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet of a storm front moving in. High above the neon, the headquarters of the corporation known as Giant Fish stood like a monolith of glass and steel, unaware that the gears of the Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's office had already begun to turn. This was the moment where abstract rumors transformed into the unyielding reality of the law. At exactly 12 o'clock, the synchronized movement began. This was not a chaotic rush, but a choreographed dance of justice refined over decades. From the Kasumigaiski district, dozens of unmarked black sedans and white vans glided into the night, their tires making a soft, rhythmic shush on the wet pavement. Their headlights carved long, yellow paths through the lingering mist of a late autumn rain. Inside these vehicles sat more than 400 investigators, their faces illuminated by the soft, blue glow of tablets. They wore those beige windbreakers that have become the unofficial uniform of the Special Investigation Department. They were a silent wave designed to be seen only when it is already too late for the guilty to hide, signaling the end of an era of perceived immunity. The first wave reached the skyscraper in the heart of the financial district shortly after the hour struck. The security guards at the front desk looked up to see a wall of officials presenting warrants under the harsh, white glare of the lobby's chandeliers. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there was only the steady, rhythmic sound of footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors, a sound that felt as heavy as a drumbeat in the stillness. The investigators moved to the elevators in groups of 6 or 8, the air in the enclosed space growing thick with the scent of damp wool. As they ascended to the executive floors, the city below began to shrink. On the 24th floor, where the most sensitive ledgers were kept, the air felt sterile, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive cologne. In the records room, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of decades of guarded secrets. One investigator, a man with silver-rimmed glasses and hands encased in white latex gloves, ran his fingers along the edge of a mahogany desk, feeling the cold grain of the wood. He could feel the vibration of the city's midnight trains beneath his feet, a low-frequency hum that matched the thrumming of his own pulse. His focus was entirely on the cabinets that held the digital and paper trails of the midnight raids. Every drawer that opened gave a sharp, metallic click that rang out like a gunshot in the silent office. They were looking for the blue folders, the ones containing the true nature of the offshore transfers that had fueled the company's impossible growth. Each sheet was handled with reverence, a single thread in the tapestry of deception. Simultaneously, miles away in the quiet, residential outskirts, another team arrived at a sprawling estate hidden behind a gate of heavy wrought iron. This was the sanctuary of the high-ranking executives who thought their private lives were shielded from scrutiny. The sound of a heavy brass knocker striking a door 3 times broke the absolute stillness of the neighborhood. It was a sound that meant the end of sleep and the beginning of a cold reckoning. A light flickered on in an upstairs window, casting a long, amber shadow across the wet lawn. The investigators entered with a firm resolve, their presence a jarring intrusion into a world of curated luxury. They moved through the hallways, their shadows stretching against the silk wallpaper, searching for the personal laptops and encrypted drives that held the keys to the kingdom of giant fish. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the raids had expanded to 22 separate locations. The physical evidence began to pile up in the lobbies and on the rain-slicked driveways. Hundreds of heavy, cardboard boxes labeled with black ink, containing the shredded remains of a corporate legacy. Each box represented a piece of a puzzle that had taken years to construct and only hours to dismantle. As the first hint of gray light touched the horizon, the investigators began the slow process of loading the boxes into the waiting vans. The paper inside, if stacked together, would have reached higher than the skyscrapers from which they were being removed. The legal turning point had been reached. The giants were no longer untouchable. The quiet of the night had finally given way to the cold light of accountability. The transition from the frantic energy of the raids to the sterile, echoing halls of the Osaka District Court felt like a sudden plunge into deep, cold water. The atmosphere was no longer filled with the heavy thud of cardboard boxes or the shout of investigators. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall and the distant, muffled sound of rain against the high windows. Yoshihiko Kawamura, once the undisputed captain of the trading giant Itamen, sat in the defendant's chair. He looked smaller than the photographs in the newspapers had suggested. His shoulders, once squared with the weight of a century-old legacy, now seemed to curve inward as if trying to shield himself from the clinical gaze of the judges. The trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was the slow, methodical dissection of a corporate body that had breathed for 110 years. Every document presented by the prosecution was a tiny incision, revealing the rot that had spread through the accounts known in hushed whispers as the giant fish. These were the deep, dark ledgers where billions of yen had vanished like stones, dropped into a moonless ocean. The prosecution spoke of the year 1989 and the year 1990, a time when the world seemed to be made of gold and endless growth. They detailed how Kawamura, alongside his managing director Sumitsu Ito, had steered the company away from its traditional roots in textiles and toward the shimmering mirages of real estate and high-priced art. In the courtroom, the air felt thick as they described the 211 separate pieces of art that had been purchased at wildly inflated prices. Imagine a canvas, perhaps a vibrant landscape or a quiet portrait, hanging in a dim gallery. To a collector, it is a piece of soul. To the giant fish accounts, it was merely a vessel to move 86 billion yen into the hands of shadow players. The prosecutors laid out the photographs of these paintings one by one. The colors seemed too bright for the gray room, a haunting reminder of the decadence that had fueled the collapse. Ito sat motionless as they spoke of his role, his face a mask of indifference, even as the court heard how he had characterized his own executive title as merely nominal, a hollow name with no responsibility for the wreckage left behind. Then there was the man who haunted the periphery of every testimony, Hyo Young-jung, a developer, a fixer, a man of the shadows who had become the architect of the company's final undoing. The story of his involvement was like a labyrinth with no center. He had vanished once, jumping bail and disappearing for 2 long years after being granted leave to attend a memorial service in South Korea. The courtroom felt the phantom of those 2 years of silence. When he was finally rearrested at a hotel in Tokyo in late 1999, the mystery of the giant fish accounts finally began to settle into a cold, hard reality. Hyo had been the bridge between the legitimate world of trading and the dark waters of speculative finance. The court revisited the loans, 33.6 billion yen for golf courses that were never finished, and even for cemeteries where the only thing buried was the company's capital. There is a specific kind of sadness in a failed golf course, a landscape designed for leisure and beauty, left to be reclaimed by weeds and silence, its empty fairways a perfect metaphor for the hollowed-out shell of Itamen. As the weeks of the trial turned into months, the weight of the evidence became an physical presence in the room. The ledgers were brought in, thick, bound volumes with thousands of entries written in careful, precise ink. Each line represented a promise made and a promise broken. The prosecutors traced the flow of money with the patience of archaeologists. They described how the funds were diverted through shell companies, hidden behind layers of bureaucratic fog, until they reached the personal accounts of the defendants. Kawamura maintained that he never intended to cause damage to the firm, that every decision was made for the sake of the company's survival in a changing world. But the judges looked at the numbers. The 14.6 billion yen lost on a single project in Kagoshima, the 23 billion lost in Gifu. These were not errors of judgment. They were the intentional dismantling of a legacy. The courtroom felt the gravity of the 110-year history that was being erased in real time. A company that had survived wars, social upheavals, and the turn of a century was being undone by the stroke of a pen and the greed of a few men who thought they were larger than the institution they served. In the final days of the proceedings, the sense of an ending was palpable. It was not just the defendants facing their sentences, it was the finality of a name. In 1993, the once mighty Itamen was absorbed, its assets swallowed by a subsidiary of Sumitomo. The name that had graced the business world for over a century simply ceased to exist. In the quiet of the courtroom, one could almost hear the sound of the dust settling on the empty desks of the Itamen headquarters. The sentences were eventually handed down: 10 years for Ito, 7 years for Kawamura, and 7 years and 6 months for Hio, along with a fine of 500 million yen. But the true punishment was the ruin of the legacy. The giant fish had finally been pulled from the water, and in the harsh light of the sun, it was revealed to be nothing more than a ghost, leaving behind a wake of unemployment, lost savings, and a profound, hollow silence in the heart of the Japanese financial world. The trial ended, the doors of the court closed, and the story of the giant fish accounts became a cautionary tale, whispered in the corridors of power where the ghosts of the ruined legacy still linger. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom have finally swung shut, leaving behind a silence so thick it feels as though the very air has turned to velvet. Outside, the evening sky over Tokyo is a bruised shade of violet, and the first few drops of a gentle rain begin to tap against the glass panes of the high-rise offices. For months, these halls were filled with the rustle of endless paper and the hushed, urgent whispers of men in dark suits. But tonight, the ledgers are closed. The scandal of the giant fish accounts, those phantom numbers that swam through the shadows of the bubble economy, has reached its quiet conclusion. We find ourselves standing at the edge of an era, looking back at the ripples that changed the face of Japanese corporate life forever. It was never just about the money. It was about the stories we tell ourselves to maintain the illusion of order. Think of those accounts as a vast, dark ocean. On the surface, everything looked calm, professional, and prosperous. But beneath the waves, the giant fish moved in circles. These were the fictitious trades, the circular transactions that existed only in ink and imagination. In the year 1991, the world watched as the Kiowa Corporation and its associates were unmasked. They had built a kingdom out of ghosts, moving billions of yen through a labyrinth of shell companies to hide losses and create the appearance of growth. To a middle manager sitting at a desk late at night, under the hum of a flickering fluorescent light, these numbers were not just digits. They were a weight. They represented a loyalty to the collective that outweighed the truth of the ledger. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from maintaining a lie for years, a heavy, bone-deep weariness that settled over the entire financial district. As the investigation deepened, it revealed the invisible threads of the Iron Triangle, that tight-knit bond between politicians, bureaucrats, and business leaders. It was a structure built on trust, but it was a trust that had curdled into something far more dangerous. The scandal forced a mirror in front of a society that valued harmony above all else. We often speak of the concept of take-me, the facade we present to the world, and Han, the true feelings we keep hidden deep inside. The giant fish accounts were the ultimate take-me. They were a beautiful, glittering mask worn by an economy that was beginning to fracture. When the mask finally slipped, the fallout was not just legal or financial. It was a spiritual shift. The unquestioning loyalty that had defined the post-war miracle began to dissolve, replaced by a slow, cautious realization that transparency was the only way to survive the coming storm. In the decades that followed, from the 1990s into the early 21st century, the lessons of the giant fish accounts echoes through every boardroom. New laws were written, and the old ways of the keiretsu system were slowly dismantled. The image of the company president bowing for 15 seconds in front of a bank of flashing cameras became a symbol of a new era of accountability. But for many, the scars remained. There were the salarymen who had spent their entire lives in service to a ghost, and the investors who saw their savings vanish into the deep blue of those fictitious accounts. You can almost feel the texture of those old documents now, the crispness of the stationery, the scent of blue ink, and the weight of the stamps. They are relics now, stored in boxes in the basements of government buildings, gathering dust as the world moves on to faster, digital forms of deception. The rain is falling harder now, washing the streets of Chiyoda and Marinauchi, rinsing away the heat of the day. The bright neon signs of the city reflect in the puddles, shimmering like the scales of those mythical fish. There is a peace in the ending of a long story, a sense that the truth has been spoken and the debts have been tallied. We have followed the trail through the backrooms of luxury hotels and the quiet corners of accounting firms, and now the trail has gone cold. The figures have been balanced, the sentences have been served, and the culture of silence has been challenged. The giant fish have returned to the depths, and the surface of the water is finally still. We can breathe more easily now, knowing that the mystery has been laid to rest. As you listen to the steady rhythm of the rain, let the complexity of the case drift away. The intricate webs of bribery, the complex schemes of circular trading, and the high-stakes drama of the courtroom are all fading into the soft gray of the night. There are no more numbers to track, no more names to remember. The world of corporate shadows is far away from your bedside. You are here, in the stillness of your room, and the story is finished. The history of the giant fish accounts is just a series of echoes now, and even those echoes are growing faint. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.